Okay, welcome back to the Regenerative Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Max Culhane, your host. We've had a little bit of a hiatus and a little bit of a break after a very successful live in-person event, the Regenerate Summit, that I hosted with Simon Lewis of How to Carnivore 2 weekends ago here in Albury. It was a fantastic weekend. I'm really excited to be able to release the YouTube videos of everyone's presentations, from Dr. Anthony Chafee, Dr. Jalal Khan, from myself, from Jake Wolke. So stay tuned for those, which are going to be dropping quite soon. For this week's episode, it's a little bit of a change or a different episode that compared to what we've talked about earlier. And it was one that I recorded earlier in the year with a good friend of mine. And Vivek is a student of philosophy of spirituality and has been considering questions around why we do what we do, what drives us, what are the motivations and desires, and how are these manifesting and what affects them. So this conversation goes quite deep into perspective, into about acceptance, into a range of philosophical topics. So if that's what you're interested in, please have a listen. If it's not what you're interested in, you might find something that changes the way you think. So in any case, please enjoy, and thank you for listening. So I think, Vivek, you're someone who has maybe done a lot of work to really understand not your own maybe motivations for acting. And I think that served you in terms of understanding how other people are responding, or perhaps make their decisions and live their lives. So maybe if you can, with that background, just share as much or as little as you want about your journey and how you got to where you are at the moment.
Sure. In terms of my journey, I guess kind of an inflection point or a tipping point was probably 2012, 2013. I was kind of exploring a lot of these different topics, yoga, consciousness, spirituality, just kind of the bigger questions about life. And I was at a point in my life where I kind of had, a pretty well life. I don't know how to describe it. I had a good job, good career, great parents, great family, great friends. And I guess something inside of me was kind of looking for more.
You had the material trappings. You
Exactly.
had the car, you had the job, you had the outward signs of material success, perhaps.
Exactly. And so I'd done some travel, vacationing, partying, all that. And then I, decided, well, what else is there? So then I started exploring kind of the inner self, the inner realm. And that means a lot of things for, different things for different people. But I would say it was just, I had a more meditative focus and, exploring some of these bigger questions. So I think my calling to explore some of these plant medicines, and different cultures, that kind of started in 2013. And then since then, it's just been a massive catalyst for me to understand myself, my place in the world, and it's unfolded in a kind of a sublime way. It's a roller coaster, but it's, it keeps unfolding, newer and newer experiences, newer and newer interactions.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about, someone might ask, what is the point of understanding more about ourselves? A lot of people are happy with a routine that perhaps involves going to work, coming home, watching TV, having some kind of recreation on the weekend, and they're very happy. And I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I think that everyone should do exactly what makes them fulfilled and joyful. But some people perhaps aren't happy with a routine like that, and maybe they're trying to understand why they're not happy or why they feel unfulfilled. So what do you reckon? Why do you think that people should maybe ask some of these inner questions?
Yeah, I think for every individual, it's going to be a unique journey and where they are, in that stage. It's like you can give, you know, the same toy to 10 different children, and they're going to play with that same toy for in different ways, with different levels of engagement, different levels of intensity, uh, and for a different period of time. And even as adults, we play with the same toys, right? The same pleasures, the same happy hours, the same, instead of one, hour long happy hour, it's a 5 hour happy hour. So it's no different um, from that standpoint. But at some point, in everyone's journey, you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, what else is there? And there's no right or wrong time. But it's like if you're let's say in your 30s and 40s and you're still playing with the toys you played with when you were 10 years old, like it's probably a little weird. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And it doesn't have to be like a decade long period, but if you're not if you're not evolving, you're probably becoming stagnant.
mm. And it's, I guess, if in the modern world, there's so many different toys that maybe we're given or that are approved, in quotation marks, approved for people to use. I mean, sport for men, it's like commonly following a sporting team, and they're like outlets. They're outlets for energy, perhaps, that individuals have, that are, it's almost like a way for people to let off steam, or let out energy and direct that energy to something external, perhaps, rather than internal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, it's your attention, external things stimulating your attention, and then your energy flowing to those things. And so whatever you give your attention to, essentially is going to grow into either kind of who you are or who you become, or it's going to be a big part of you.
Yeah. And I guess what we maybe are going to explore in this conversation is that the value of perhaps turning that attention rather than on external topics, whether that's a sport team or the accumulation of material possessions, the pursuit of prestigious careers, or maybe causes external to us, the accumulation
Mm-hmm.
of power, all these external things. I mean, what is the value of, instead of focusing our attention on those, really turning that attention inward? Like, why would we do that?
Because at some point, the things that bring you pleasure will also bring you pain. And so, not pain, but it could not necessarily pain, but it could be suffering. It could be, it could be lack of contentment. It could be just numbness to, the same things that brought you the same level of pleasure. And so you're gonna want to turn inward. And the reason why inward is because if you turn outward, then you're just kind of monkey minding from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And whether you do it through materials pursuits or spiritual pursuits, like the underlying goal is essentially the same, is that you want more. Um, but when you turn inward, it's not just more, it's how do you become one with all of it.
Mm. And that feeds into a very universal philosophical concept. I believe maybe it was the Epicureans, or the Stoics, sorry. And the point
Mm-hmm.
was that desire is suffering, and
Mm.
and they're not the only ones who said that. I think it's a very universal. I mean, Buddha, I think, said a similar thing. But the act of having an unfulfilled desire is existing in a state of suffering. And the more unfulfilled desires we have, or I want that boat, or I want that, new car, or I want that new handbag, all those
Mm-hmm.
things that we want, that we don't have or haven't achieved yet, are basically preventing us from feeling fulfilled in that moment. What would
Yeah.
you say about that, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, if I can maybe bring up something that came to me, uh, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or so in my meditation. And it's kind of the framework that I look at things with. I don't know if this is the right moment for it, but I feel like that's kind of where we're converging. And kind of the thing that came up for me through my meditation was this idea of what is everybody chasing, right? Um, and kind of the answer, the revelation that happened was that everyone's chasing 5 P's, 5 different P's, and the first one is paper, right? So, and that's kind of basic. Paper could be money, it could be education, it could be a degree, it could be an award, it could be a certificate, it could be many different things. Paper kind of takes care of your basic life needs for most people. So everyone's chasing paper, kind of to some extent. The next one is once you have sufficient paper, then well, what do you do with money? What do you do with all this money? Is you want to convert it into pleasure. So that's the second P, is pleasure. Um, and most people can get trapped between this loop of paper pleasure their whole life. After you get a sufficient amount of pleasure, you kind of want more. You want to, you're not, you wore these shoes, now you want those shoes. You drove this car, now you want that car. So then you want to do it on a bigger scale. You want bigger things. You want things for others, that are close to you, your family, your friends. You want to do it on a bigger scale. And so then the third P is power. And, that's power has negative connotations, but it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing. You can be powerful and, charitable. You can be powerful and, detrimental to society. So power is neutral in the sense that fire is neutral. Fire can heat you up and warm you up, or it can burn things down. So, paper, pleasure, power. After you get to a certain level of power and scale, you're going to want the next question that's going to come up is purpose. Like, what is all this about? I have all this money. I've done all the pleasurable things. I've crossed things off my bucket list, and I've done them adequately for myself, for others. I've scaled it out, and then what you're really looking for is purpose, for meaning, and that's probably how billionaires think, right? Maybe not all of them, but at some point, paper, pleasure, power is, they've done that. So they want to have a legacy. They want to have a purpose. They want to have an impact. They want to, like Steve Jobs says, create a dent in the universe. So purpose becomes the focus, and it's not necessarily that it's, you can chase those things even in the spiritual realm. You can be a yogi, you can be a monk, you can be a priest, right? I mean, even the church needs paper to run, and pleasure and power can be extracted to various things, not just through material comforts. So in that sense, everyone's going through these consciously or unconsciously. And what they're all trying to arrive at finally is the last P, which is peace. And the irony of it is that you can't add those things up to get to peace. Peace is kind of the underlying thing that is what remains in the absence of the pursuit of those first 4 P's.
Yeah, I love that. You can't add them up to get to peace. And
Right.
you see people who've tried their hardest, perhaps even over a lifetime, and they've accumulated houses, they've accumulated cars, prestigious jobs, but all those material things, all those external things didn't get them any closer to a state of inner peace. It's almost like they had a notion that they were running towards a goal, but the goal was not even in that direction. It wasn't even close, and perhaps a whole heap of energy was used up or misplaced or expended trying to achieve something or trying to find something, but it wasn't even there in the first place. Imagine like cutting down a jungle to kind of think that you're getting to some kind of ruins, but the goal of that expedition, I mean, what you're actually looking for wasn't even located in that geographical spot. And
Yeah, you yourself might end up in ruins.
yeah, and I don't think that the process of going on that journey is a bad thing, because I think the process of going on that journey.
What's important is to not forget that this is all kind of transient, right? Ephemeral. And the suffering, I think the Buddha said that life is suffering, but I don't think that's probably what the Buddha said. Life is suffering if you're attached to the illusion of life. So there's a subtle difference there. Is the attachment? Attachment is suffering. Ego is suffering. Identity is suffering. There's all these words for it, but life itself is celebration. It's not suffering.
Yeah, I really want to chew over the 5 Ps framework, because I think it's such a valuable way of thinking, a useful tool to think about life. And since you told me about it, and we talked about it maybe 8 months ago now, 6 or 8 months ago, I've kind of been trying to fit my understanding or observations about people in the world into it, and it seems to so well and so easily encompass everyone's behavior. And what I think is that, as you said, alluded to, there's a little bit of chasing of P's that we basically have to do to have a basic existence. And no one's suggesting that we put down all pursuit of money and live as vagrant monks begging. That's not what we're saying at all. And obviously that minimum amount of paper, which is wealth, and a minimum amount of pleasure, I mean good food, a minimum amount of power, which is maybe power to look after one's family, and have some standing within one's local community, a little bit of purpose. They're all good and necessary, and I think they're very, very important things that are part of living a fulfilled life and having a holistic and deep human experience. But what Vivek and I are saying is that when the pursuit of one or more of those P's becomes the sole focus of life, or the focus, the incredibly maybe blinkered focus to get to peace, then I think that's when the pathology arises. Would you agree with that, Vivek?
Yeah, I think it's, you can pursue all of those P's consciously. You can pursue pleasure consciously with awareness. And if you do that, you're not going to get entangled in it. You can be in a state of peace and still go through all the other P's, right? It's when you forget, you forget the final P, or the original P of peace. That's when you get entangled and you get attached and you get suffer and you get identified with how much paper you have or how much influence you've had for the last decade, and now you don't have it anymore, right? It's those things. So it's kind of nuanced in that sense.
And if you would tell that story of maybe when you brought up the concept of the 5 Ps to maybe some colleagues, you told me a story about that time, and the type of people they were and what the response was.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the time I was in a kind of a corporate sales role, and, I was probably one of the younger sales reps there, and everybody, had been, kind of successfully, living their sales careers in the world. But this is something that resonates with everybody, like no matter what stage of life you are, is they're aware of, the paper, pleasure, power, purpose. But most people assume that they can get to peace through adding those up, or they assume, well, they're not going to get to peace in this lifetime, or they're going to try to they're going to try to focus more on purpose later stage of their life to kind of cancel out all the pleasure seeking and whatnot, and hopefully that they'll be they'll get some sort of salvation and they'll get peace. Or some of them, for others, it's they're probably not going to live in peace, but they might rest in peace.
Yeah, it's something that people have an understanding of varying degrees and at different points. And yeah, you always hear stories of people who, I guess, maybe arrive at this realization a bit later in life. But as you said, everyone's walking their own path. And it's not necessarily that it's not a linear thing, and it's not an expectation of anyone. I wanted to frame this in the context of a lot of what I talk about, which is metabolic health and disease and lifestyle. And what I see in patients, particularly, is a pursuit of the second P, which is pleasure, and particularly using food, processed food, and the pursuit of that dopamine hit through the consumption of processed food, to get to peace. And
Mm.
it's interesting because the way I think about food addiction, and I think it is addiction, and maybe it's any form of addiction, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, drug addiction, or any other addiction, is very squarely within that second P framework, which is, as you mentioned earlier, it's the continued insistence or the continued pursuit of pleasure in an attempt to get to some kind of peaceful state. And the food addiction is often an attempt to fill a hole, and maybe that hole was dug early in life, in the form of early life trauma or a difficult upbringing, or some kind of event. And people are using food, just like alcohol or anything else, to, I guess, fill a void and try and get to peace.
Mm.
And it's not necessarily, it was inevitably a doomed endeavor, because we know that from what we've just talked about, you can't add it up. You can't eat more Snickers bars and somehow reach a state of peace. I mean, that
Yeah.
should be pretty obvious.
Yeah, it's obvious. But I think it's not so much. Um, so your example of food, particularly, and it's pleasure is primarily chemical based, right? Either you're putting a chemical in your body, or you're doing something that's triggering a flood variety of chemicals to your body, right? You can do extreme sports, and that produces adrenaline, and that's pleasure, and people will go on doing more and more extreme things, right? So it's really it's altering your chemistry. Is That's what you're doing, and sometimes you can alter your chemistry by consuming another chemical object, or it's more subtle. It's because it's what's available to you. It's what you have access to. It's what you kind of grew up with, right? That you just consume certain things. And so it's just a unconscious thing. And then you don't even think about it as I'm doing it for pleasure to get to peace. There's just deep, probably neural pathways in your brain that say, eat that. And you just kind of do it unconsciously.
Yeah, and that loops back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is there are subconscious desires that are motivating a lot of people. And I think anyone who's engaging in addiction, maybe even more so with food addiction, these are unconscious desires. I think, the alcoholic or the person who's addicted to drugs, I think there's more insight into the fact that that's probably an addiction. But processed food and sweet food and carbohydrates and sugar, it's so condoned in today's society, in the US and in Australia, that I think there is less recognition that is an actual, an addiction. But no, I fully agree that it's the pursuit of that chemical rush, and the goal, I think, isn't to satisfy that chemical demand. It is to reduce the actual need for the chemical hit in the first place.
Mm.
And that is about reducing desire, or the magnitude of desire in the first place. It's not, you're not going to get anywhere meaningful by dumping more dopamine into the system. I think the goal should be to reduce that desire in the first place. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you can reduce desire, but you can't reduce desire without understanding your relationship with the desire first. It's something that is, if you're identified with what it does to you and your sense of self, reducing desire means reducing yourself. That's what reducing desire means. The more, like, because life, makes it seem like the more desires you fulfill, the bigger, more enriched life you lived. right? So reducing desire sounds like I'm just going to stay in a dark room, right, and not do anything. So it's the relationship with it, how consciously you pursue it. It's you can chase any of those P's as long as they're not the ones pulling you,
Yeah, and
and you're not chasing them. It's you're consciously choosing, I want to make X amount of money, I want to focus on these pleasures. And when you do that, the relationship is less entangling, and you're not over time enslaved to those things.
yes, and to frame my earlier comments, I really had in mind, someone who is engaging or very much addicted to refined foods, and they are overweight, or they become diabetic, or they're suffering from health issues as a consequence of that desire, or that attempt to meet that desire for that hit of dopamine through refined foods. And when I said the goal should be to reduce the desire, what I had in mind is that there is a biochemical and physiological reason why those kind of addiction pathways exist. And particularly if you listen to my previous episodes with Tucker Goodrich, and he talks about the specific breakdown products of linoleic acid, which are in seed oils, they drive overeating through their effect on our what's called an endocannabinoid system in the brain. So there and sugar does a similar thing. So what we notice is that once we give patients, or we help people adopt a more nutritious diet, particularly with plenty of high quality animal foods, those desires seem to disappear, or at least be highly minimized. So I guess to frame everything I said previously is the goal isn't to stop enjoying your food. The goal is to take what is a habit and an addiction that isn't serving you and is causing metabolic disease and causing you to go on a trajectory towards very, very poor health, and transform that into desire for nutrient dense, high quality, nourishing, truly nourishing food that is going to heal you, and that is going to let you live and help you live your most thriving, healthy state. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah, I think it's a I think it's a valid point, and I would say there's probably other layers to it. It's getting access to nutrient dense foods, may be different for different people on different socioeconomic levels, situations, right? It may be different in terms of let's say, how busy you are, with your time. Maybe what you have time for is focusing on paper, right? Or whatever. It's there's time constraints, there's money constraints, and then there's probably like social constraints, in the sense that if you grew up in a family, or you're around social circles where you're probably going out and eating what they eat, well, shifting that radically to a conscious way, even though it's better, you might feel like you're shrinking yourself out of the world that you knew.
Yeah.
So it's I think there can be many facets to why somebody got into it in the first place, and even if they're aware, why they may not as easily change trajectories as radically, unless something drastic happened, or they had some awakening or some revelation, or they were in the hospital bed and had to reflect on all of their life for a month, right?
Well, that's a good opportunity to kind of talk about behavior change, because
Mm.
it's a fundamental aspect of human reality, which I've observed, and which is that everyone has a different proclivity to change entrenched behaviors and habits. Some people easily, and some people not. But there's always a stimulus. There's always a state of disease, literally,
Mm.
or disease that forces someone to change. And maybe different people have a different amount of unpleasant feeling that prompts or stimulates that change. But everyone has to go through some low period before they're stimulated to make big lifestyle changes. What would you,
Mm.
how do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess in that sense, maybe the Buddha was right that life is suffering, because you have to go through a certain level of suffering to change or to wake up, right? And so I think that statement, life is suffering, is when you get to that level of acknowledgement in your life, that's the inflection point when you can say life is. If you get to a point where you're like, life is suffering, that's the tipping point. That's the inflection point for that person's life. And then that can shift to life is celebration. But, if you've been suffering for a long time, then it's going to be a different unfolding or a different path, right?
And reminded me of something that you said to me once about the magnitude of adversity as a trampoline. And
Mm.
I want you to share with the listeners what exactly you meant by that, because when we go through difficult periods in our life, it's not always clear at the time what effect that could have, and particularly what beneficial effect that could have on our life later on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, adversity, you can look at adversity as the extreme adversity. You can look at it as like a defrag, running a defrag on your old Windows 95 computer. I don't know who runs those machines anymore, but if you remember the defrag, that's basically what it's doing behind the scenes. It's breaking everything down and rearranging and cleaning it up and getting rid of things that are weighing your life down, weighing down, the speed at which, you can operate your body machine. Um, and so, yeah, I think adversity is kind of inherent, right? It's not something that you can, it's, people look at adversity or darkness as some malevolent thing, but there's a benevolent side to it, in the sense that it's trying to get your attention to look at things in a more deeper, more focused way. And, from that standpoint, it's, yeah, you have to suffer until you finally focus on, let's say turning inward or making a transformation in your life.
Yeah, and I think it's a critical lesson in maybe people's progression, which is the realization that what is happening at that point, whether an event or um, a milestone, particularly an event, isn't necessarily good or bad. And that's a pretty big statement to make, because
Mm.
from childhood, we're used to saying, "Oh, this happened, that was so good," or "That happened and it was an unfortunate event." But with, I think that once we realize that when something happens, we're not actually sure whether that's a good or bad thing, because we're not aware at the time what doors that might have opened. And though it might have closed some doors, it's also opened other doors. And that's how I like to think about adversity, because the seed of everything that appears to be adversity is opportunity. Um, and there's always something good that can come out of a difficult situation. And that was the trampoline analogy that you told me about, is the deeper you go through something from an adverse point of view, the higher you can potentially be sprung up onto a new
Yes.
path.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's, it's the more, yeah, the more severe, the um, more depth, a being has, the more light it's going to, shine through them eventually. Um, I would probably also add that, it's, eventually you get to a point where the kind of the dualities are irrelevant. So adversity, I look at, it's just contrast. It's just shadow. You need black, or you need darker tones in a painting. If you're only painting with white, do you even have a painting, right? And if your life is filled with local contrast in artwork just means that, uh, even when you zoom into a painting or a photograph or a piece of art, um, you know, within a certain cluster of pixels, there's darkness. There's dark colors and light colors, and it actually makes the overall image, when you zoom out, far more vibrant, far more enriched, far more dynamic.
Yeah,
And so everybody is essentially, doing that in that sense, right? So if you have a 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and you say, well, I don't want any jigsaw piece in here with any darkness, like, it would, you probably would not be very interesting.
yeah. The other comment on adversity that I want to make is, there's a great video by a philosopher, Alan Watts, and it's called "The Story of the Chinese Farmer." and we'll put the link in the show notes for everyone to watch. But essentially, it's a Chinese farmer in a village, and he loses a horse, and then all the village members come along and they say, "Oh, that's such a bad thing. You're so unlucky. It's so unfortunate." And the farmer takes a very circumspect, non-reactive, and maybe just accepting stance, and he just says maybe. And then the next day, his horse returns, and he brings 7 wild horses with him. And then all the villagers arrive, and they say, "Oh, that's so lucky. That's so great. You're such a fortunate man." And at that point, it would be tempting to agree with them and celebrate and say, "Yeah, yeah, I'm so lucky." But again, the farmer takes a very circumspect approach, and he says maybe. And the next day, his son, who is riding or trying to break in one of the wild horses, falls off and breaks his leg. And again, the villagers show up. You're so unlucky. Your son's broken his leg riding this horse. Um, and again, he says maybe. And then the following day, conscription officers come to take his son away to the army, but they can't take him. They don't take him because he's got a broken leg. So it's like everything that we think that is a good or a bad thing at the time, it's unclear at that moment in time. And maintaining that neutrality of perspective, or that acceptance, perhaps, to me seems like the best approach, as that story illustrates. I mean, what would you think, Vivek?
Yeah, I mean, that Chinese farmer is at that final P, right? Which is peace. He's not solving for purpose, or all those other things that come with the first 4. He's abiding in the peace, not even solving for peace, because solving for peace sounds very mental, very much a mind game. And like we talked about, you can't add to peace. He's just abiding in it, and by abiding in it, it's actually things. The first 4 actually get solved by abiding in the peace, because when you say maybe, well, you're not. It sounds like you're being numb or passive or indifferent or callous, but really what you're doing is you're creating space. You're not just holding space, you're creating space by being in that 0 point. You're creating space for new possibilities to solve problems in ways that you couldn't have imagined. And
Yeah,
so when that Chinese farmer says maybe, he's creating space for all possibilities to play out. And so he may be in his environment, maybe in a state of, let's say, entropy or chaos or disorder. But by being in that 0 point, or the eye of the hurricane, or that peace, he's actually transmuting it into lower and lower forms of entropy. So there's a word called nej entropy in physics, and it basically means that it's like reversing the outward entropy around you into a more harmonious, fluid, more synchronistic form of way.
yeah, I love that, and that really leads into the I guess the question that maybe many of you listeners are thinking about, which is, so we've got this framework of 5 Ps, and we're told that the first 4 don't add up to the 5th. How, Vivek? How do we get to this 5th P? And it sounds like what you just said is that we can access this 5th P whenever we want. We don't have to be reliant on the first 4 to a large degree in order to get to the 5th P. So how do you think about maybe explain a bit more about how you would access that piece?
Mm.
And it sounds like acceptance
Well,
is a key part of that.
yeah, I think but then it's acceptance that you don't know how to untangle yourself from the first 4 Ps. And once you do that, then you have a more objective relationship to it, right? Then you've created distance with it. So I think getting to the final P or piece is to pursue. Either you can say, well, I'm going to drop all this, go off into the mountains and be a monk. Well, the mind is still going to come with you, so you can't, like, even that doesn't achieve anything. So the only option is to assess your life. How you've pursued those other P's up till now, and why you pursued them. And once you have an understanding of that, then you kind of gain micro peace, across all of those things.
The that's a great way of thinking about it, and I guess it's about a consciousness awareness of those 5 Ps, and maybe it's useful and valuable for people to think about their own lives and the time that they spend and in the context of the 5 Ps, and especially if they're not feeling fulfilled, or they're feeling like they're not getting their emotional needs met or their spiritual needs met, um, to analyze their situation in the context of the 5 Ps, and understand where they might be pinballing between of the first couple in order to get to the fifth. I think, coming back to the Chinese farmer, he, as you said, he was existing in that eye of the storm. He was existing in that complete state of, it's not ambivalence, and I think that's a really important point. It's not nihilism. It's not screw it, whatever happens happens. It's a joyful, completely content acceptance that whatever might happen is for the best. I think there's an angle of optimism to it. I mean, maybe that's just me, but would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say it can also just be acceptance without any of the other adjectives. It doesn't necessarily have to be optimistic or joyful or any of those, right? Because those are still directions for the pendulum to swing. Well, maybe not right now, but tomorrow, you know, it'll be a little better. Um, so if you look at the Chinese farmer parable, it's, when the son comes back with those 7 horses, he's not reflecting on his yesterday's acceptance and basking in and be like, yep, I knew things were going to turn around. He's just saying maybe. By saying maybe, he's staying in the now, in the present. So he's neither going to compare it to the past, nor is he projecting into the future of what may happen if he rides one of those wild horses and falls off. Right? He didn't project that either. He's just saying maybe.
Hmm.
And by saying maybe, you're expanding your space for more and more pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to fall into place. If you constrict the space in which you can solve your jigsaw puzzle, or jigsaw puzzle meaning jigsaw pieces that have fallen into your life right up till now. If you constrict that space, then there's tension. There's non-acceptance of each of those pieces. But
Yes.
the more you allow, the more those pieces can fall into place, and not necessarily that they all have to connect to the first piece that you started with. They can get solved in clusters in isolated areas.
Yeah, and that reminds me so much of mentalities that you come across that certain people hold, and they have restricted that possibility space for themselves by bringing with
Mm.
them preconceptions about life events. And what they often are doing by carrying a negative connotation with them is painting their own hell. And something might happen, and they might say, "Oh, I'll never be okay after this," or because of this
Mhm.
event, I'm my life was ruined. Or, I mean, to sound a little bit dramatic, but often that's not uncommon that you hear someone say that. And the tragedy of that perspective is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because, as you've just said, Vivek, you're really just painting yourself in a very, very narrow possibility space. And unlike the Chinese farmer, you haven't opened your consciousness or your mind to the possibility of all these positive outcomes that could have happened as a result of that one event. But you're only bringing a negative brush. That person is only bringing a negative brush to bear, and it really feeds into that idea of perspective, and life is exactly what you make it. And if you're bringing negativity, you're going to manifest negativity, and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah, like attracts like. Um, as we were talking about this, I had another kind of image pop up in my head. But when you watch a play or a movie, right, with, let's say, many many characters, a good movie, not a good movie, I would say a great movie, or masterpiece of drama or cinema or play, is really the evolution of all players, or all actors, um, all artists, all on the same stage. So from the point it begins to when the curtains close, every single actor is evolving through a journey. And, friction between certain actors may look detrimental for the outcome of the play or the movie, but it's really for the evolution of individual actors as well as the overall narrative of the story. So the Chinese farmer saying maybe, he's not just saying maybe from his point of view, it's maybe from a much grander scale of not just looking through a keyhole of his own consciousness. He's saying maybe on behalf of his son, maybe on behalf of those horses, maybe on behalf of those, the military that came to get his son. Like, who knows what that maybe could be? And it's just allowing greater and greater harmony to fill in that space.
Yeah, I really like that framing, and I think it's so valuable. And it's a challenge. It's not like we can get to that state. I mean, some people are more inclined, I think, to feel or to be open to that type of acceptance and thinking than others are.
Mm,
But
mm,
I think the story itself is so illustrative of the benefit of adopting that acceptance type mindset to just allow things to happen and allow things to unfold, and trust that, just trust the process. Simply trust the
yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah, it was funny. We were talking about acceptance and trust. I was talking about these same two things with another friend. Um, and, they sound very similar, right? Like trusting. But trusting can be hard, like trusting the unknown, trusting like what may happen tomorrow can be hard. But acceptance is a bit more logical, a bit more, well, I accept that I don't know what's going to happen. But it's much harder to trust something that it's kind of like, you know, walking into a dark cave and trusting that there's no snakes there, right?
Yeah.
With this, at least through acceptance, you become more conscious and more aware and more logical, and so it's almost like a prerequisite to being in the trust. And trust, I feel, is very much like heart based. And if you've kind of navigated through life and society not from being in your head, and it served you well, it's hard to shift to the heart space.
Yeah. Yeah. But the benefit, I guess, is enormous.
Yeah,
So maybe suggest people can give that a try. I mean, the next question is, what are some ways to adopt a mindset that is more in keeping with, say, like the Chinese farmer? How would one go? Say they're listening and they've applied their own life to the 5P framework, and they'd say,
mm-hmm.
Vivek, I can see myself. I've definitely got more than enough paper and pleasure, but I still find myself ping ponging between these two
Mm-hmm.
P's, and I can see that I am after peace. But what are the next steps? Like, how could I get closer to that feeling? I guess from a practical point of view, I still have to work a job. I still have a family. What would you say, or what advice would you give?
I would say I think it's important to clarify what kind of peace you're looking for. If you're looking for a conditional peace, where if paper and enough pleasure, then there's peace for a year, let's say, right? If I harvest enough mangoes this season, I'm good through the winter. So that's conditional peace. Um, Unconditional peace is when you are tired of running through the algorithm, a bajillion iterations and of if then, if then, if then, if then. When that whole algorithm or operating system that you've been running on collapses or gets to a tipping point where you're looking for an unconditional peace, then that can happen in an instant. It doesn't need time. And it doesn't need your effort, because what it needs is dropping of all efforts of chasing the first four P's. But for most people, that can feel like death of who they are. Like, if I'm not chasing paper, I don't get any pleasure. I don't get any power. I have no power, no influence. I have no purpose. Like, I'm just like, use toilet paper. Like, what, like, how can that be peaceful? Like, the mind can't fathom that.
Yeah, and that gets into a topic maybe that we can talk about next time, which is ego. and and why and how the ego operates, and how it, I guess, in many ways protects us, but can sometimes maybe lead us astray. But I would definitely agree with what you said, and it comes back to that idea that you can access that peace at any time, but it's not necessarily easy. And if there's accumulated embedded layers of I guess narrative or societal programming that tells you need the house in the rich suburb, and you need to have the BMW, and your kids need to go to the private school, then it's going to be very difficult to let go of those belief sets, and
Yeah.
maybe identify only the ones that are truly in service of yourself and your progress.
Yeah. I mean, you can either be, what's the book? The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. I think it's one of those classic self-help type books. You can also be the monk who buys a Ferrari. Like there's no reason you can't abide in peace, and all the other four P's can align themselves to you or can flow towards you, right? But if you think you're going to add those first four and get to a conditional peace, maybe, but it's not going to last, right? It's something's going to take it all away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's a great point to wrap it up. And
Yeah.
I really want to just summarize for everyone, and I think that you've done such a great job, Vivek, of laying out this framework for us and for the listeners. And again, it's not about everyone going on a spiritual quest and ending up with no possessions, sitting in a monastery. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about hopefully cultivating, or helping you cultivate, an awareness of your own life and how that fits into this framework of paper, pleasure, power, purpose, and peace. And through that insight, or through that application of this framework, is to better understand yourself, better understand subconscious desires, conscious and subconscious desires, and hopefully get closer to what you truly need, rather than what society might have told you need, or some other external influence has told you need. So, Vivek, any closing thoughts?
No, I would just say follow your bliss, uh, and do it, I guess, with a certain level of awareness, and I think everything else just starts to align, instead of following any ideology or anything else. Just I think everybody deep down knows what makes them truly happy, and if you do that moment to moment, or day to day, or week to week, even if it's just one thing, it's going to snowball into aligning to your own framework, right? Aligning to your own self, and all these things, you'll see that like it unfolds in a magical way.
You heard it, folks. Follow your bliss. Well, thank you so much, Vivek, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure.